Sorry, give me 1 second. I have too many pages. So. Past the peak of COVID-19, the biggest killer around the world was not the disease, but it was poverty. It was the poverty, the starvation in Shanghai that took hundreds of lives, the poverty in the developing world and their crippled economic developments. A few pieces of setup at the top of the speech. Firstly, we're still happy to maintain strict rules at the peak of the pandemic, so peak 2020, 2021, April, March, whatever. But however, these would be more temporary lockdowns and would have ended much shorter. Secondly, we're still happy to offer positive incentives in our side of the house, where presumably the rational incentive of governments and Western countries and many countries around the world is still to prevent the spread of the disease that is crippling their economies and taking lives. So notably, there was some incentives if they were not able to do the direct and most strict lockdowns, to do things like offer some unemployment benefits to people who would want to stay home, but not make it mandatory for many companies to shut down and to stay home and impose lockdowns, or to do things like try and fund the option of higher education in places where this happens anyways, or things like, for example, to offer some stimulus and financial incentives for people to do things like take vaccines or to take time off of work. And notably, many people do have incentives to stay home and to take this option, because firstly, the symmetric incentives of these governments to protect from the disease means they have incentives to do things like spread education and awareness about the impacts of COVID and how bad it was. But secondly, the people see examples of people dying, like you hear stories of people you know, even if it's only distantly, dying or suffering significant illnesses or significant consequences from COVID-19, which gives you an incentive to do so. So the main difference in this debate and the trade-off with the people who knowing all of these things, would have still chosen to not stay home or to do things like wear masks, etc. And I suggest they have very good reasons to do so, as we'll explain in this debate. Sure.
Think very carefully. Do you close the borders soon enough? Yes or no? This is very strategic for you.
You open the borders much faster than they did in the satisfaction. Briefly on the impacts of COVID. I would suggest that developing countries, and if anything, COVID would have been much worse or much better on our house than individuals. Why? Because firstly, I would suggest that developing countries had more money to do from things like exports when borders did not shut down. They would have had more capacity to pay for things like healthcare or hospital beds for people who are sick. And notably, in these countries, they did not implement very strict COVID-19 lockdown restrictions anyways. So COVID would have been better in many of these contexts, whereas they were the ones uniquely harmed because they were seen as most contagious and had their borders closed down. Secondly, I would suggest that they would have more supply of vaccines anyways. Where in the Western world, people were getting second vaccine, third vaccine, sometimes even 4 vaccines in total, which meant that the supply for vaccines to be shipped to the developing world was much less. So if they want to talk about the importance of COVID and how bad it was, we think in many cases it would have been far better for many people. One argument on why this is better, this is economically devastating, and I'll briefly talk about the psychological impacts of COVID. On the economic devastation that happens to the direct strictness of the lockdowns for prolonged periods of time. Firstly, on consumption. Many people could not stimulate business because they could not go out and to spend money and to do things like, for example, many service sector goods that could not be purchased online. So things like going to restaurants that were forced to shut down and other forms of direct in-person service sector jobs where many businesses had to close. Secondly, and very importantly, this applies across many different sectors. This is production, where many people could not go to work, where many jobs found it very hard to transition virtually. Things like manufacturing, physical labor, that most of the lowest income people rely on for their jobs. And many of these jobs were unable to have meaningful amounts of employment because of these lockdowns. But also, I would also suggest many service sector jobs make the transition virtually much worse as well, where it was often very inefficient for example, not have face-to-face interaction very speedily and expeditiously. But also most of these jobs that were in fact the most vulnerable people are those that are the most difficult to transition online to things like manufacturing and physical labor. But thirdly, and very critically, there's a massive problem with trade because many of these countries, whether it be China, whether it be, for example, many Western developed countries as well, were forced to shut down or chose to shut down their borders to avoid things like contagions in the developing world, to avoid things like COVID-19 spreading across ships overseas or by cargo or by plane and all of these things. And the importance of this, that the harms on trade were massive, because not every country has the ability to produce everything, or things like, for example, food are influenced by seasonality. This is one of the main reasons that we saw many cities in China, like Shanghai, saw massive amounts of starvation, or even restricting mobility within a country means that if one place is seasonally not being able to produce food, you cannot import it as easily from other countries around the world, or other manufactured goods as well. Notably, all of these different mechanisms, even if you can mitigate them in isolation, are compounding off of one another. When you have a lack of consumption, even mildly, and a reduction in demand, this further reduces employment, which means there's even less consumption in the future and makes production even harder. But things like minor losses of trade increases the cost of living, which means there's even less consumption as well. When people find the goods too expensive to purchase, they cannot buy and consume, which even further compounds with the fact that those businesses shut down because nobody's buying their goods. Fourth mechanism, I think there was a massive loss in education as well, where students across many Western countries who were forced to stay home from COVID-19 lockdowns in Canada or the United States were not able to go to school. And notably, this again affects the most vulnerable people who attend public schools, who did not have fancy private schools that could invest in fancy Zoom school that also wasn't even that good anyways. And for these schools, they could not afford any form of virtual alternatives and had nothing to do. But also, even if they were virtual, like the virtual schools were shit. They were mostly asynchronous because the teachers are already understaffed and underpaid and did not have resources to do things like invest in fancy online training programs that could keep students meaningfully engaged. The students slacked, they did not learn, they did not actually do anything meaningful. What is the impact of this? Firstly, it's learning, where literacy rates are the lowest they've ever been for these generations that are years and years behind, where they have been crippled in their ability to do even basic arithmetic. But secondly, it's socialization and emotional intelligence, where they cannot interact with other people because they're forced to stay at home. But thirdly, for many low-income families, this had a massive direct economic impact because you rely on schools to provide things like daycare for your children, to provide public school lunches. You cannot feed the families yourselves, which massively crippled many households. Notably, if they say there was state support was bad because the fact that so many people could not work and had to receive unemployment benefits meant the states had to spend so much more on so many more people on their state house that was deeply inflationary and exacerbated problems like stagflation, which mitigates the impacts of any stimulus because if you raise interest rates, it also offsets the amount of money that you have because you find it harder to borrow. Comparatively, much fewer people in our state house would have chosen to take time off of work. Notably, this has very long-term impacts, where A, the loss of skills from unemployment are exacerbated into the future. If I do not work for years and years, I lose my skills and I lose my productivity, which has long-term economic implications. But secondly, you harm future generations that would be productive, or kids these days are fucking stupid and brain rot. These are the formative years of their life when they did not do anything meaningful to develop their brains at a time when it is uniquely neuroplastic, or develop meaningful social skills at the time in which they were most susceptible to learning these things. But thirdly, consumer expectations compound. But deflation in China happened because people entered the depressionary psychological state, but they did not spend, which meant they expected other people to not spend either. So everybody's collective interest, which is saved, they think everybody else is not going to spend, which is a phenomenon that's persisted to the present day. Finally, briefly on psychology. People's psychologies were crippled by the prolonged lockdowns. It's things like the direct isolation where you cannot have face-to-face interaction that many people find is important. The fact that you're stuck with these same people, or you're harmed in familial relationships, and you have no ability to escape the people in your home, which makes tensions boil over, and you're stuck in the same place day in, day out, with the monotony of having the same setting, also harms your psychological psyche when the days blend together. For all of these reasons, we're so proud to propose.
I would like to thank Prime Minister for the great speech and our welcome to the conversation.
Let's go. That the global pandemic was difficult, regrettable, and really tough for pretty much everyone is a given. But what I want you to remember, and what I think is easy to forget in hindsight, is that what we were talking about were lives. That in an unprecedented way, everyone you knew was suddenly at risk and affected, and particularly the people closest to you and vulnerable. That what we found out was the elderly, it was that everyone thought of their grandparents, of their older family members, of their teachers at school, who were now at risk of death. Drastic times called for drastic measures. These were the only ways to protect people. Two claims in the speech. The first is going to talk about why these drastic measures were integral to saving lives and why we can weigh nothing higher than this in the round. The second is going to talk about the comparative, why the social and economic harms we faced were heavily mitigated and indeed made better in the long term by drastic measures. First, let's talk about protection. The thesis of this claim is that underside opposition's world of a brief lockdown which incurs most of the economic shock they fear, but none of the benefits of long-term protection, we would have lost many more lives. Why was this able to massively slow the spread of COVID-19 as it happened? First, as it rampages around the world, there is no herd immunity. The reason we get around things like common colds or other things which didn't have the unique structure of COVID-19 is that there's some pre-existing immunity, which means it doesn't rampage through as massively. Second, we obviously had no vaccine and no clearly effective treatment. So other medicines we use for other illnesses didn't work as well as they used to. They couldn't kick this long cough or breathlessness that people had. We didn't have the capacity to protect people. But thirdly, this was uniquely infectious, that any contact meant infection with surfaces, with individuals, and so on. What is crucial about this is this wasn't something that happened for a month or 2 months, but it was something that remained true for many months after it existed, that we still didn't have information, we still didn't have vaccines. This was true into the long term. What did preventing and slowing the spread do? A few things. A, it required us to have time to create better research which informed people on how to protect themselves, to understand if it did spread on surfaces, to understand what medications might help to alleviate their symptoms, to think about the structure of this and how we might be able to tackle it in the long term, what can we do to have mitigation methods. Secondly, it was crucial for vaccine development. Important. The mRNA vaccine was unprecedented technology that had never been effectively used on a vaccine before. That means that it takes time to make this something you can roll out to people. It's not just the hypothetical technology was there, but was it safe to roll out on the mass market? That took a long time. Thirdly, and crucially, slowing the spread means preventing mutations. Remember the mutations we talked about at the beginning. Alpha moving into Delta, moving into Omicron. It was rapidly changing. So not only did we not know about it when it started, but it's very difficult to know about how it developed. That happens much faster when it moves quickly through the population because it moves through different demographics, different age groups, it mutates according to different climates and backgrounds. So mutations would have moved much more rapidly. Why are these things crucial in relating to speed? So why do we need long-term lockdowns in order to tackle this? First, allowing for the rapid change of mutations means that all research becomes quickly redundant because we're unable to understand the next mutation that's manifested and either our information becomes useless very, very quickly. But secondly, they are just much more dangerous to people when it spreads this way. Mutations resist much better. They have worse symptoms for people and are increasingly dangerous. So it's integral that we slowed down the spread in order to develop things that mitigated against the harms we came out of lockdown. The only reason people were willing to come out of lockdown is because the vaccine they could get in their arm to walk out and be protected. The second overall thing, though, that it did was reduce the strain on an already breaking up system. So we also prevented the spread of things like flu, of common colds. We reduced the amount of time people were getting hit by cars. The important implication of this is that being ill in the pandemic with COVID not became a death sentence. Because with flu, you couldn't get a ventilator anymore when you went into the hospital, or you contracted COVID while there and died. So the point was that guaranteeing that we reduced the strain on the system was the one that made it able to save the people who mattered in the moments that mattered, to build up the beds and ventilators and intensive care that we needed in order to protect people. So healthcare systems were much more able to survive. Let's talk about why this matters. The implication of this analysis is that millions of deaths were avoided by the drastic action that we took. I challenge government to stand up here and be willing to weigh this out. I challenge them to say that a year of your high school experience was worth even one life. I took time out of school, I was affected like everyone else.
Yeah.
I know I would have stayed there a year and another if I was able to stop the spread to the nursing home that my great-grandmother was in and keep her alive. I think it's borderline impossible for government to stand up here with a conscience and say they would weigh that above any other impact in the ground. And I would suggest that most people agreed with this, that most people were terrified for themselves and the people that they love. There was a remarkable amount of compliance where it would have been impossible for the police to put everyone back in their homes. And that's because this is the human instinct to care about the lives we could have saved. But there are additional implications beyond this. Second, we protected people's livelihoods in the long term because counterfactual is not a functioning economy, but where workers were sick, where they were taking time out, where they had to leave their jobs due to long COVID and being unable to continue, where people really struggled to survive and rebuild in the longer term. So it wasn't a society that could have functioned even if you allowed people to do so. And we'll do more of that in the second claim. Anything to say in closing?
Yeah. What do you think happened to the rate of femicide across the developing world during the pandemic?
If this is a claim you can outweigh deaths with the amount of femicide, I think it's going to be difficult to do. Domestic abuse that happened in COVID was horrific. It always was. This was a global pandemic and the illness was killing more people. If you want to weigh on scale of lives, I'll do it. Secondly, let's talk about the claim on why we are able to mitigate strongly against social and economic impacts. This will be partially responsive. It's going to explain why the comparative of what we traded off really wasn't so bad. The first is, and an interesting fact, is that Sweden said we are going to allow the rampaging of COVID to the population. Interesting. Sweden's GDP stayed relatively similar to the people around it. It didn't grow much better, even though it wasn't in lockdown. Why? People stymied their own economic and social development. People were afraid. They didn't spend as much as they used to. Now, I hear you say, does this not say people would have self-locked down and self-protected? No. Because people were not as complete as a lockdown needs to be. So they didn't go and inject stimulus into dinner restaurants and the economy generally. They said, I'm going to try and be cautious and spend less, but I'm still going to go see my friends because I'm really desperate to celebrate their birthday at their house. And that's how it happens. Secondly, there are less nice people. There are enough rich, conscientious spenders who can afford to stay in their home and don't stimulate the economy, while people who really didn't care about your grandmother and grandfather would go out and carry on the spread when they didn't have a lockdown that's forcing them to stay in their homes. The implication for counterfactual was never normal, but extremely constrained and limited. Second, we were able to adapt. It took time, but all the harms happened in those few months we didn't know how to do online school. In their world, the economic shock of suddenly shutting down industries happened in their world. So those are all things that happened quickly, but we reduced that harm over time. We work out spread out infrastructure. Government support was better because they had to fund furlough schemes rather than saying you chose not to go to work because you were scared of getting sick. Essential workers had to work either way. We protected them best as we always protected the vulnerable and opening opposition.
Leader of opposition for the great speech, and I welcome DPS.
The reason I had to take a few breaths is because I also have asthma-induced COVID. Had I gotten it a few months earlier, I would have gotten a mutation that did not cause this long COVID. First, I'm going to make the bold claim that rapid expansion of COVID would have been better for people's health. First mechanism under this. They say development was bad. Notice, they say hospitalizations would have increased on their side in the short term via me. I'm going to explain why the mutations were much less lethal in the short term. Notice, the data you get from hospitalizations is the only data. There's no other way to know oxygen levels in your blood. Blood pressure rises. No way to know long COVID effects and the way that the first symptoms show up in order to detect diagnoses earlier. Hospitalizations earlier would have meant that this data could have been accumulated faster, turbocharging the mRNA vaccines and stuff like that they say. Second, they say mRNA vaccines took a while to approve. But this is just a question of how much you pressure the FDA. Notoriously, there were many backlashes against how much the FDA took time in order to do tests against mRNA vaccines. They had the usual incremental period of testing it on animals and only then on humans. We think on our side of the house, the public pressure based on hospitalizations would have meant only human trials. This is good. We know that mRNA vaccines work, as they themselves point out. A lot of vaccines would have been faster. Now let's flip them. First, mutations would have been much better on our side of the house. And I want to explain the mechanism for which mutations happen. The issue with mutations is The virus does not want to be lethal or destructive to its host. And the reason for this is because of two things. First, if it kills you faster, you do not sneeze or cough as much. Second, if it makes you more sick, you stay at home more and insulate from other people more. Problem. On their side of the house, they forced this anyway, because people had to stay at home anyway. So there was no selection for mutations in order to prioritize those mutations that were spreading much faster among the population and weeding out the mutations that did not go as well. It was much easier to remain and infect your family members with the more lethal mutation and to prevent them from getting an easier mutation earlier on that would have still made them immune to the later mutation because they relied on the same SARS-CoV basis. Second of all, there would have been also more exposure outside that would have created more immunity. Several reasons. First, vitamin D is one of the most essential components of the immune system. Less people going out meant less sun meant bigger immune systems. Second, most people do constant exercise. They walk in their muscles and their blood pressure starts rising. This triggers a more strong immune system, as you know. People do exercises because it creates more robust ability to cope with infections. On our side of the house, the lack of exercise, particularly the rapid lack of exercise that was a change from previous immune spread, would have meant that immune systems are weaker to contend with COVID to begin with. Thirdly and lastly, the psychological effects that I'm going to chat about in a second created a series of destructive habits that meant that people were much more susceptible to COVID. First and most notoriously, vaping and smoking rates skyrocketed in China during the COVID. And the reason that this is extremely destructive is you need to understand how COVID works. COVID works first by destroying your alveoli sacs in your lungs, same way that smoking does. The reason this is really important is it meant that people had less of a baseline amount of lung capacity to deal with on their side of the house. This means that on our side, more people would have survived. Wait. Even if on their side of the house, there are a few people that have to suffer lethality in the first few years, on our side, we're able to prioritize between them. We know who has high oxygen levels and low. We know who needs to go to the hospital first. But the spread of mutations in an uncontrolled fashion is something we couldn't control if we didn't make sure that the virus expanded quickly enough. Second claim, on psychological effects. I have a few things I want to say here. The first is, I want you to understand the difference between seeing others through a screen and seeing others in person. The fact that children are used to forming attachment to their parents through touch, through hugs when good things happen. That their kindergarten and their elementary school, before they went to high school and had to go on Zoom, where friendships formed and going together to places outside the home, meant that there's already a way that you form relationship that is based on physical touch and based on closeness. Second of all, this also meant far more tense home environments. And the reason for this is because many men that were used to a work life of going to the office and coming back to dinner, spending a little bit of time with their kids, and now have to face coming back home into a home where their wife was more stressed because she had to take care of the kids every day. Their kids were running around and spiraling because of the fact that they don't have the friendships or access to romantic relationship. Their teenagers were experiencing that angst and the wish to go out of the home, which you wanted to prevent them for in order to not have things against you. All of that is really important because it meant that the return of men to the home created a massive amount of tension between them and their wives. There were essentially two options. Either the men had to take on more responsibilities and lash out against their wives, which created an immense amount of home-life violence, or the wife had to take on all the responsibilities. All the responsibilities of every single day entertaining the kids, making every dinner for the husband, and being there for all of them to be just interesting enough so none of them are bored. This is an immense psychological burden. The final thing that I want to point out here is that the education collapse that Liz explained happened for a very simple reason. In the absence of a routine where you have to go to school, when you could turn off your camera and your mic, kids just didn't have to learn. They weren't in the school. They were not tested, and it took us a while before we found ways to insulate against them testing through a computer screen. This meant that the incentive to do well at school, the ability to focus when it's all through a screen and not the physical touch that I described before, plummeted, and our access to high-skilled workers in the future to deal with whatever new pandemic comes our way declined as well. In this argument, the psychological argument is important for a few reasons. Number one, the psychological consequences of COVID-19 and the years in it cannot be underestimated relative to deaths. The idea that depression now lives within everyone that had to face the immense pressures, and their only way of coping was to desensitize to their husband and their children screaming at them. The fact that ADHD disorders have sprung up in the world, which meant that education access in the future became much worse, and our perceptions of our own failures became much more strong as well. All of this means that many more people have to suffer a life of constant feelings of inadequacy compared to the pre-pandemic period when they did better, they focused better, and they had role models and parents that were happier. This is a sadness that can and does equate to the question of how many lives are lost. The final thing that I want to talk about is why lack of response to our economic argument is staggering. The first thing I want to point out is they never explain why people can't just choose to not go out into work if they don't want to. Nor do they explain why businesses couldn't lay off people or send them home, as many service-based businesses did anyway, if it was better to have everyone home than to have some temporary workers subbed in and out. Businesses could still make the choice. Individuals could still make the choice to not leave. It is ops' burden to explain why you had to do this. But moreover, Liz's explanations about the destruction of supply chains that are based on humans being able to transfer the goods, based on humans being able to take storage things out of the plants in China and stuff like that and move them across the world, meant that we could not and we prioritize service-based services online as opposed to manufacturing-based things. This is crucial because it meant that if they want to do is to prevent death, if the developed world has as much purchasing power to the vaccines, to hospital access as the developed world, our ability to choose who we take in is good. For those reasons, OG.
Thank you again for the very fine speech. Now welcome Yellow.
Okay, can everyone hear me? So the OG frame seems to be that your benevolent boss is going to say, go home, don't work in the grocery store, don't work in the pharmacy, out of essentially benevolence and letting care for public health. And so basically they get 80% of the lockdown because, I don't know, if it's unsafe, just don't go to work, don't earn money. There are no government supports this world because the government wants you to go to work so you get mutations earlier for their case. However, the benefit that they get seems to be not at all in proportion to 80% of the economic activity at the same time, which they would need to make their case work. The key thing that was missed in Sophie's response is that the big spenders, the wealthy who could go back to their homes, turn them into castles, ordering money from essential workers who continue to have COVID spread in delivery vehicles and in restaurants, they would stop demand very significantly, and they make up the majority of demand in the economy. Economic confidence in the stock market and investment all still would have dropped due to the uncertainty of this disease. Now, the first thing I want to do is engage with their frame, that it was better to spread earlier than spread later. The first thing to note is that this is just a bit of a false comparative, because the comparative on our side is also many people never get COVID or only get it way later once there already is a vaccine. So they did not prove this whatsoever. Second of all, they say there'd be public pressure to speed up the vaccine. Two responses. One, these vaccines were the fastest vaccines ever developed. The timeline is typically 10 years, it was 18 years under Operation Warp Speed. If you sped these up anymore, no one would take them. They'd say they were human challenge trials, they weren't safe, they weren't tested. We did the minimum speed required to get people to take these vaccines. But I also want to flip this argument. The fact that people were offered vaccine passports to get out of lockdowns and said, you can go to the cafe, you can go to the bar, if you wear a mask and you get vaccinated, actively incentivized significant numbers of people to get vaccinated, meaning they got significantly milder versions of COVID, because it said, you get your freedoms if you take this vaccine. Many people decided that lockdown, which was very unpleasant given all the reasons OG said, was less bad than getting the vaccine. And there was huge compliance on first and second doses in the developed world. The last thing to say is that the intensity of lockdowns clearly varied. Developing countries that are largely reliant on manufacturing, per their claim, had less state capacity to enforce lockdowns and indeed had weaker lockdowns than developed countries did. Like liberal states of America obviously had way more intense lockdowns than did Bangladesh. So that's extraneous response to opening down. The second thing is just to refute the claim that mutations would have been less bad. First, just weigh this on plausibility. You would have a tenfold increase in the number of people getting COVID across age, across gender, across geography, etc. Even if I believe some of this bogus science, frankly, about, it doesn't want to kill you and so on. He clearly does kill a lot of people in the process. The flu doesn't want to kill you, but often has the accidental effect of killing a very weak host. So even if you believe the bug science, disagree with a public health expert, you would still have to accept the weighting, which is that you would then get this weaker form later on. A, that you would take the vaccine, B, that you could be sure it would get weaker, and so on. But also remember the uncertainty that public health officials are making these decisions under. We didn't know which mutations were possible, and if they had unchecked spread, we have no idea how the science would have changed, what kinds of mutations would have occurred, or how to deal with them. They say if we had more spreading, there would be better data. We already had excellent data, right? Every country in the world, remember, had public data tracking how many cases and where they were. Last thing, very obscure in their case. Their case is people dying in hospital hallways because there are not enough ICU beds. Their case is what happened in New York in April 2020. Their case is what happened with the Delta variant in India. Their case is people knowing that if they go to the hospital because they have the flu or a broken arm, they may never come home. Their case is a healthcare system, which in almost all countries that have public healthcare systems, which is the majority of the world, so already heavily overstretched, underfunded, trying to cope with this, and it would have been extremely unsuccessful. Now let's directly respond to the remaining material on what happened in the home. The first thing they said was learning loss. A couple of important things to note. Number one, PISA scores, that is the educational assessment scores, are the highest they've ever been across the world. So obviously it is the case that this was recovered, and a subset of generations, likely 2 or 3, lost out on some learning. This means that they are 10 to 15% less intelligent. They're also going to university where they're going to learn things. They have remedial courses that were offered in the majority of countries to deal with this learning loss. Second, recall that as lockdowns went along, we got better at Zoom. People got used to using it. Teachers figured out how to use it. We realized how masks work, that it wasn't enough just to have a fabric mask, even an N95, for example. So because we brought the level of cases low using extended lockdowns, we're able to reopen with modified measures like wearing a mask or having partial online if we're in person for a few days. Because the level of cases was low, that way the healthcare system could deal with this. And that was the calculation the majority of countries made. The next thing they do is they say that there was large-scale economic collapse. A couple of things on the empirical things here. One, like the best difference of different societies have on this is the Sweden thing. Because Sweden, you remember, is the country that was the author of the Great Barrington Declaration, which is the thing that the debunked science, the opening government wanted about how you let it spread longer. The problem is that Swedish GDP was no higher on a synthetic counterfactual than Finnish or Norwegian GDP, the two most similar countries. Now, you could be disingenuous on CG and be like, oh, but they're developed countries. Yeah. They all need to be similar because it's different to different design. That's the design of the research method. The key point is that GDP did not meaningfully recover because the marginal spenders were still afraid to spend. But spread continued disproportionately because people left the real economy. They dined out less, they traveled less, borders were closed, they still saw their friends, they still slept with people, they still went to universities, and the most selfish people went on their side. The ones who are willing to take these risks, the ones willing to infect their grandparents, willing to infect their friends, and so on. So what do you have at the end of the case? Even if I accept the majority no thank you of their right, and I say people were lonely, they were upset, and there's absolutely no denying that alcoholism and drug abuse increased, although I think much of that was the stress of a life-changing and life-altering pandemic, which would have been non-comparative. Domestic abuse increases due to stress because husbands are upset about losing their jobs or getting furloughed and then they're home. So unclear how comparative that claim is relative to general fear. It's obviously an increase. The most certain thing in the debate is the number of lives who die because we literally have no hospital beds for them, because fewer take the vaccine, because the virus itself has predicted closing.
So it's true that like the virus kills people. Do you think not being able to provide food for your family over the time also kills people?
Yes, again, there's two important responses. One, the countries with the least severe lockdowns and the world countries where food security was the most significant factor. The second thing to say is that imports and exports, like the operation of ports, still function. Those were the most essential functions. Automation was increasing these things. The cost of shipping containers rose and commensurately more supply entered. Obviously, the subset of workers that literally made ports function, literally made supply chains function, continued to function in a modified way. We ended up paying higher consumer prices for these things. But it was not the extended lockdown that led to these far-reaching impacts of significant food insecurity. Additionally, government invented many government programs, like delivering food to people, like having hospitals and community centers distribute things. So there were ways to cope, which improved and got better over time. On way, opening government suggests that you could outweigh other things on life. They suggest that you could outweigh loneliness, that you could outweigh drinking, you could outweigh domestic abuse. But they never actually did the weighing, did they? They just said that you could do these things because they were unwilling to. They were unwilling to say that tens of millions of people certainly die in their world in search, maybe, of a society where we're more free to see our friends and admittedly get some benefits like seeing people in person and going to classes. Ultimately, this is a bit of a trade-off, but there's a significantly more selfish side. I am proud to say that people took this sacrifice, had some honor, and said they needed to make sacrifices for the better of humanity and the better of the elderly. Very proud of us.
Thank you, Sofia, for this very fine speech. And thank you for your excellent podcast debate. Now I welcome your government.
Hi, can everybody hear me if I speak like this? The COVID-19 pandemic killed tens of millions of people. The next pandemic will kill hundreds of millions. Yes, we are running the superbugs case, but we will rigorously mechanize it and prove why it is the biggest harm in this debate, co-opting opening opposition's way and filling in opening government's missing gap. First, why do we think that the strictness of measures used against COVID-19 mean that measures against a future pandemic will be significantly more lenient? First, nobody actually defined what drastic measures were compared to the more lenient measures that opening government defense. First, the drasticness of the measures means that the most drastic measures often came earliest in the pandemic. Consider China's zero COVID policy was implemented immediately after COVID came to the country, where they said we want zero COVID deaths. So we'll totally shut down international travel and internal migration. Consider many other countries that shut down like global travel very early in the pandemic. Problem. Many of these governments had to reverse some of their decisions because they were operating based on very little information and were making overcautious prescriptions to people. Consider the massive flip-flopping on mask mandates, right? Mask on, mask off, people were very confused. The problem is, even though there's like a complex scientific debate going on here, people don't see that. They just see at one point the government was telling you to wear a mask and now they're not, right? This is Joe Rogan's like stupid take. So many people internalize this and distrust the government. How this was communicated to people was also quite ineffective. Like, do you remember flattening the curve? I still don't understand what exactly that means. We didn't have time to test the most effective strategies to increase compliance with things like vaccine mandates because we wanted to immediately impose the strictest measures and make sure people felt sufficient fear such that even if COVID was an immediate threat, even if people were dying around them, they would comply with those measures. So this actually counterintuitively hurt people's willingness to buy into this, even if in the short run they did because they were scared. In the long run, this hurts their trust in governments. Secondly, it was strict, but it was also a very flip-flopping policy. Like, consider how we had a second wave of COVID because many countries lifted restrictions on international travel after they had a period of strict bans on it. The reason for this is that there was a massive economic cost that kept rising to keeping people shut in their homes and not allowing businesses to operate. And there was a collective action problem, right? Because the first country to remove travel restrictions on international travel would be the one that benefits from a massive economic boom for any competitors possibly could. More businesses would migrate, more people would come as tourists to that specific country. So it was exactly because it was strict that there was massive urgency to reopen the borders, to reallow internal migration, which is what allowed the Delta and Omicron second COVID wave to happen in the first place. So, and importantly, people believe that they suffered for nothing when that second wave happened because that first thing was totally ineffective. They said stuck in their homes, all of opening governments very severe harms occurred, but people believed that it happened for nothing, which is what led to fear and uncertainty that led them to buy into conspiracies. Thirdly, where did strict responses actually happen? Because the motion says nothing about them happening globally and universally. There are particular countries such as Bangladesh, with opening opposition name drops, and Sweden as well as Sri Lanka, where the strict response didn't really happen. Two problems here. First, these countries realized that they massively benefited from not engaging in the otherwise global strict response. Consider countries like Greece, for example, that reopened their tourism industry quite early. They had a massive competitive advantage, both because they had greater domestic tourism, which kept their economy relatively afloat, and because they were the first to benefit from high levels of international tourism, because they had stayed open for far longer, the tourism industry was still thriving. Second, many developing countries were able to retain a greater number of their skilled labor force when they did not impose strict restrictions, because these people were able to keep their jobs, because these people were able to educate their children. So many people after COVID chose not to migrate to developed countries, and this was a massive benefit. All the countries that didn't do this, all the countries that realized that they were stupid for having followed the advice of developed countries of the UN, of the WHO, will realize that in the next pandemic, they don't want to be left out of this. That short run, electorally determined governments will have the incentive to be the ones that free ride on global herd immunity. Finally, there was also a principal agent problem in the implementation of strict COVID-19 policy. In countries like China, this necessarily had to be delegated to regional governments because the country was so big. Problem, when it was so strict, and when the federal government threatened to remove you from power, threatened to cut your funding, threatened to replace you with another federally elected official, that's when you underreported deaths. That's when you engage in incredibly harsh and restrictive measures, such as literally jailing people for even the most minor violations of COVID-19 policies. This was something that we discovered afterwards. And this is what led to massive mistrust, and people realized that governments had been overinflating the COVID-19 numbers. Fifthly, this led to the rise of the right wing and the far right, which massively increases mistrust in state institutions. Why? Because, and this expands all of the previous reasons. These are the kinds of political parties that feed on anti-authoritarianism. They say libertarianism is good, do not tread on me. They co-opted specifically many left-wing narratives surrounding the idea that the big pharma has captured the government, that there's a deep state that's working against them. So the left wing was also less able to call them out because they were called hypocrites. Because what about my body, my choice? What about big pharma is a massive lobby and they have too much control over the government? This is why, in many cases, most governments did not survive the pandemic. Incumbent governments were voted out. You know who wasn't voted out? Meloni. And you know the new right-wing parties that emerged in places like Slovakia, in Hungary, in the UK, that were even more far-right and even more extreme than existing incumbent conservative parties. Finally, this led to massive distrust in the media because the reporting of COVID deaths was quite difficult. Given strict measures, like it was very difficult to go to people's houses and see if they actually died of COVID. So a lenient response would have been far better in this case, yes.
Onto your side, immediate and overzealous lockdowns still happen per opening. Government mistakes on messaging, flip-flopping come from politics still happen. Who trusts these governments, especially when they watch people die?
Flip-flopping doesn't happen because the reasons are exclusive to a strict response, and I also don't think it would have been as strict. I don't think opening government concedes this. Finally, vaccine skepticism massively increases on their side of the house. First, many vaccines made people sick and some of them died. Problem. In the short run, when this was reported in the media, and when everybody was at home because they didn't have schools to go to, when they didn't have jobs to go to, they had nothing to do but scroll social media, nothing to do but see the fake news in front of them about how the vaccine is actually killing them and putting microchips in their brain. Secondly, people who survive this are going to be the ones who in 8 years' time face the next pandemic. These people have a massive survivorship bias. They didn't die because of COVID-19. Many young people survived with very few symptoms. But they did face with the massive economic costs, the massive costs of not being socialized, the massive costs of being incels for the rest of their lives. They never learned how to talk to women and they never got married. These are people who will vote against COVID-19 or COVID-20 strict measures, and this is quite bad. Finally, future pandemics, why are they likely? Global warming means that parasites are spreading to new parts of the world because they can live in warmer temperatures. Vaccine and antibiotic resistance means that the measures that we have against them are not as effective. Immunocompromised individuals exist precisely because of COVID-19 and the increased vaccine skepticism, which means people are now listening to RFK and drinking raw milk and not taking necessary vaccines. So we will die in the future if you don't vote closing down.
Speaker for a certified speech. Now, welcome us for the opposition.
Hey, yo.
I would first like to thank CG for providing the case in the last minute of their speech, and now going into my slides. The problem with Doppler is the following. OT says, oh, we do this precisely. It's a counterfactual to provide how the fuck we do it precisely. You don't have information. During COVID, the spreading was so fast, which means that probably you are not able to gather data on weight, mutations, etc. They say, oh, you gather them from the hospital. Brother, you don't know what to gather. They say oxygen levels. How do you know these oxygen levels are the thing you need to support measure? Therefore, what we say is the following. If you're not able to precise measures, it is definite that you pull the plug way before you should, and this leads to way more deaths. Secondly, let's deal with opening opposition. Opening opposition says, oh, lockdowns are good. No shit, Sherlock. We're going to say why we need to prolong them, and therefore, why that's better. Going to our case, we're going to talk about developing countries and why they necessitate prolonged lockdowns and why without them they would suffer because of lack of international coordination. Why is healthcare infrastructure in these countries particularly lacking? There are three things on this. The first is not even healthcare related, it is purely infrastructure related. I.e., it is crowded metro areas. It is crowded areas in general due to density population and bad sanitization. This means that any form of contact of disease deals with the thing, right? While in like developed country, you probably don't have the same extent because of sanitization. It is easy to crowd people in the metro areas, etc. But B, the healthcare facilities in themselves are problematic in ICU. Like Max Rose says, oh, you don't have ICUs. Why? Here is the reasons why. Three reasons. No, thank you. Because you never had the crisis before. Therefore, there was no necessity for you to build up a massive amount of ICUs in the first place. Second of all, because they're uniquely expensive and require raw materials you don't have. This simply means you need to import ventilators from China. You need to import stuff. But three, You don't have enough doctors. Notice, it takes time for you to have doctors because you need to go through university, you need to finish university, you need to do specialty, etc. Which means that these systems get overcrowded, it is literally impossible for them to do anything but that. Why is this crucial in this debate? Because it means that we don't really care about research. You can do research while hospitals are not crowded. What we do care about is the ability for you to maneuver during A, an infrastructure that is collapsing, and B, a healthcare infrastructure that is collapsing. Why then, if you don't do this, these developing countries are fucked? There are two things on this. One, it is easy to violate the law because there is lack of enforcement. Notice, in ours of the house, it is a mandate. I.e., you are unable to leave the home. There is police outside, therefore you will go to prison, etc. Therefore, you will be forced inside your own home. This means we don't go to transportation, etc. But notice, because we never pull the plug early, you do this for the entirety of the pandemic. And the government, especially countries that are poorer and don't have actual information, pull this plug way earlier. Meaning, people, when COVID-22 spreads, going to metro stations in Bangladesh or buses, therefore get sick and die. This is correct. But second of all, it is easier to sort out people on the arse of the house. Why? Because even if you have very few ICT facilities, if you have less people coming in, therefore you're able to sort them out. OWO says, oh, what about people that, fucking get hit by cars? This is not as crucial as people getting sick in vast amounts of transportation globally. And therefore, we prove to you on scale why the amount of people that get sick is so immense. Okay. Then, why then international coordination is necessary for these countries and will not happen inside government? There are three reasons for this. One, because some states would enforce things differently. I.e., some states would allow borders to cross. Some states would allow non-vaccination to happen. This means that for some states that have very strict measures, and for some other states that don't, it means that it is easier for transmissions to happen between them. Why? Because it's not an international coordination of shutting down borders, of doing this. Why there was international coordination in the first place during COVID? This was the WHO enforced it through vaccine mandates, that part of the info slide or the motion, and B, because the EU and other international bodies gave specific deals that necessitated countries that enforce these mandates. These were prolonged mandates, exactly for the information asymmetry that I've described to you previously. But second of all, immigration is particularly bad thing during times of COVID. This is because two things. One, it is hard to check people, but it's easy to check products. I.e., you can sanitize products that come in through imports. It is hard to sanitize people because maybe the COVID test does not show that they are sick, etc., or because they have a new specific type of mutation. Flipping both top half, because mutations happen mostly in the developing world the moment you have bad sanitization and bad healthcare facilities. Therefore, if you don't necessitate mandates for them to be at home, it is way more likely that you increase the amount of this happening in the first place. Okay. What then is most likely the counterfactual in open government, but before that, open government?
Developing countries didn't do lockdowns, but India would have had more money to buy hospital beds from exports, and we don't triple Western demands for imports from unemployed.
No. They would get money through FDI because the US doesn't want to get sick. So I don't know why the fuck you don't get the first place. But B, are we reliant on building more hospitals in the first place? We just simply say to you it is more cost efficient to put people in homes than hospitals. Therefore, it is the only thing that developing countries can afford in this specific situation. Okay, why are then mandates the necessity for this to happen? And here I want to talk about vaccine mandates because somehow let's miss this. Okay, why are people not vaccinated in the first place? There are three reasons why vaccine skepticism rises during crisis, independent of whether you do mandates or not. The first is religious. You don't want things to be done in your own body, and therefore, you avoid the vaccine in the first place. Second of all, it is regulatory frameworks. People think the government is doing something bad, etc. No, this is not linked to mandates specifically. It is linked to the government doing propaganda for you to get vaccinated in the first place. Therefore, if people don't want to get vaccinated, you need to force them to get vaccinated. This something can only happen in CO. Why? Because you have the police force you. Because if you don't do this, you're unable to go to work, and therefore you will have to get vaccinated. Okay. Lastly then, let's do some weighing of developing countries to the rest of the day. Thing one, both government teams need to provide what is the comparative that these governments could do if it's not massive amounts of mandates and enforced lockdowns. Since they cannot do it because because everything else costs significantly, or B, because you don't have the pre-built infrastructure, and infrastructure takes a long time, it means then that the only way to stop the COVID pandemic from spreading from after 2022 in these countries is by completely locking them down. Why then does it scale over the top half? We agree with OWO death is important and probably is the most important thing in this debate. We're talking about magnitudes of death way higher than everything else. Because we're talking about countries that cannot build this infrastructure. We're talking about countries where you don't have even the bare minimums to have the healthcare in the first place. Meaning that it's not just people getting sick, it is people dying. But second of all, since it is international coordination, it means then that countries that do well are able to share this technology, share the stuff. Therefore, we're more guaranteed that even you know when to pull out the plug on the COVID mandates in themselves. Therefore, stop faster. For all of the above reasons, vote still.
Member of House for the 30.6. Now, welcome government.
I'm not done with it.
Thank you. Okay, Samuel, is this? Okay, great. I think the massive problem which sinks both government teams in the debate is they're very unclear as to what the margin is. Because they say that, COVID was really bad, but here's the thing. Their world is status quo, one where several million people died, where Delta mutations happened in India, and I saw the funeral carts, the funeral pyres on the Ganges burning, stacked 7 bodies deep at the height of the pandemic in 2021, despite one of the strictest lockdown regimes at the time. The analysis we came to at Chinese typically does 2 things. First, it explains why flip-flopping happened and premature lifting restrictions happened anyways, even in countries that had very strict first wave lockdowns, which meant the strict costs of the first wave probably weren't worth it, insofar as most of the dying happened in the second wave in Delta. And particularly in countries where many people died of COVID, like India and the United States. Second, what this analysis proves to you is there was a concurrent rise in massive distrust of the government and the media, often crimes correlated with a rise in far-right government. What is the implication of this? 2 things. 1, it means far-right governments are more likely to be in power in the future when pandemics hit. 2, it means generally speaking, political parties, even if they are not far-right or conspiracy theorists, have far less political capital to get people to enforce very strict quarantine or lockdown policies because people fear them, because people distrust them far more, and these mainstream parties are more scared of ceding power to the far-right. Why then is this extension the most important thing in this round? Very simple. 2 things to say here. First, pandemic preparedness is likely going to be gutted in cases where governments are scared of the far right or are far right. 3 reasons. 1, in many cases, pandemic preparedness is very expensive. Think of keeping vaccines in cold storage, testing kits, and so on and so forth. There's an incentive to defund it in order to boost post-pandemic recovery. Second, the right wing, when they come to power, often purge many public health officials. So many long-time bureaucrats in national health ministries stood up to the right's conspiracy theories during COVID. When the right comes to power, like to fire them. See RFK Jr.'s cutting of the American Department of Health, for example. Right? Third, in many cases, right-wingers are generally anti-science for a variety of other reasons, like they deny climate change, etc. Because of this, they think healthcare spending and science funding in general is superfluous. They think much of the vaccine research that happens in universities, like at Oxford, because we developed one of the COVID vaccines, very good. But they think many of this university funding is liberal and elitist and whatever, so would love to defund. Because of this, pandemic preparedness is likely to be gutted when the next pandemic comes around. Now, trying to do all this future analysis to prove why the next pandemic is not a matter of if, but a matter of when, and will be far more lethal. 3 reasons. 1, trying to tell you people are weaker. COVID means that there is less immunity, but in particular, lockdown has meant that people have less herd immunity even to other diseases like the flu and common cold, which could mutate, for example. Second, in many cases, as there's a greater proliferation of drugs and antibiotics, and as diseases develop to defeat them, there's an increase in strains of antibiotic resistance. So there are more diseases in the future that will likely to have higher fatality rates because it's far harder to treat them. Third, global warming means that current carriers of diseases, but also disease bacterium in the first place, are able to spread beyond their current habitats in the equator. This is very important because when they spread to habitats where they haven't existed in the past, other creatures and organisms in those more temperate zones lack pre-existing resistance to these bacteria as they spread, which increases the lethality of future viruses. Intuition one. COVID, even at its worst, with Delta had a death of 3%. Imagine a virus that is both as contagious as COVID and kills 10 to 15% of all the individuals it infects. This kills far more people, and I think will give you very compelling likelihood analysis to prove why this is true. Weigh this. One, I think this cleanly weighs over our opening government because it proves to you that, like, if you get virus, you certainly die, as opposed to all of the other like secondary impacts on the economy or on education. Second, we are able to significantly mitigate opening opposition and closing opposition's impacts insofar as we prove that many of the deaths of COVID have still happened on their side of the house, and those are probably the majority of deaths of COVID. But also, if their metric is lives, far more people die in the future. Next, I think this is cleanly evidence debate already. But let me just flip opening government and closing government and win on their own terms as well. Specifically, I like closing government's idea in developing countries. Unfortunately, you're wrong. The opposite is true. I'll flip it. Okay, before that though, opening, yes, POI.
Regarding a future pandemic, you have no idea when, what, where, or how it will track on to fluctuating politics. This pandemic happened. You would have gambled those certain lives on this guess.
Yes. So two problems. One, this does not engage with the many risks which I'm going to give you for why this is likely, and this will be very bad. But even if you don't know when exactly it will happen, the fact that we prove it's going to be very lethal, it will likely happen at some point, which you should weigh this very heavily because many millions of people will die. Two, we're not planning this to beat you because we prove to you, like what the rebuttal does is proves that the pandemic that's happened on your side as well. Now, more flips to opening government and closing government. Here's the basic problem. So the vast majority of like COVID deaths actually happen in the developing world, and here's the problem. In most cases, many of these developing countries have very strict lockdowns. India, for example, I remember being grounded at home for like 3 years in my life. 2020 to 2020, it's pretty bad. Problem, two things. One, there were many people in developing countries who are migrant workers. The places where they were laboring, in like metro cities, for example, urban laborers, are not the same as the farming communities or villages where they initially came from. Second, many people in these developing countries are very, very poor. What does that mean? In India, the minimum wage is in the single-digit dollars per day, which really isn't enough to literally feed you for more than a week if income dries up. So, what does this mean? Even when lockdowns happened, people were desperate and people were hungry. Two things to say here. One, as opening government tells us, rich people in developing countries, such as myself, who were in lockdown, we fortified, but we still wanted our food deliveries, we still wanted like things delivered to our homes. So we still bought these services. Second, in many cases, these individuals, the poorer individuals, had a lack of information because they didn't have access to like these news services or immediate like stuff. Even then, there was like many conspiracy theories spreading on WhatsApp and so on. So many of them, for example, thought that this would be only a temporary thing, or that they could perhaps go back to their villages and like just farm and like weather out the crisis. 3 ways in which this actually worsened death in the developing world. First, in many cases, because the police had made it illegal to like work outside, and there was a lockdown, they just like refused, they continued working, but just refused to submit to things like temperature checks. Second, in many cases, they just didn't have access to things like N95 masks and working with cloth masks, put them at massively increased risk. Third, migration, the fact that there were no jobs in many cities, it was the shortfall of jobs, but you saw like crazy scenes across India as hundreds of thousands of migrant workers had to go back to their communities. What is the problem of all of this? One, the vast majority of them still dying. The close to 1 million or slightly over people who died in India, this was the main part of where they died. But the difference now was all of these are given you indicate why they would have been worse off as opposed to when they were perhaps under a much lighter lockdown system, but still submit to say temperature checks and swabbing. But second, this unlocks the benefit on economics because if people who are going to get infected anyways, that is significant because this is most of the world, then it's better that they were at least able to like put food in their tummies and not die of starvation. This also flips closing government because they put the cart before the horse. The access skepticism arose because of the way in which the lockdown was prosecuted and trying to prove. For all of these reasons, vote CG.
Thank you, Government Whip, for a very fine speech, and now we will close the debate of Whip.
Can I be shared here? I need to use the microphone. I need to use the microphone. I'm like, I've done a thesis to this study of biomedical engineering. I'm gonna take out CG because I think they're kind of intention within their case, and I'm gonna weigh on top of that. One, notice the last response. They say people don't boast the measures, and therefore they spread out and they don't have social distancing and stuff like that. This response takes out the majority of CG's case, right? Because if people don't oppose social distancing, then all the stuff about the new viruses coming up are not likely to happen in the first place. But then secondly, we have a unique piece of framing on CO that explains that this is a game of time. It's about slowing down the virus and having capacity in the ICU. How this looks like? Notice, OO mentions ventilators. They don't have the capacity to explain why ventilators matter in the first place. 3 ways that CO does it. One, these stuff are selective in hospitals. They're very, very expensive because notice, oxygen capacity, like in order for you to concentrate oxygen, you need to keep it outside of the hospital, which is above the hospital, right? So this means that you have to build the infrastructure with pipelines that lead to the rooms of the ICU, which is very heavy and takes a lot of time to build this type of infrastructure in the first place. This means that only a few hospitals have ICU. This means that you have a low capacity of people in order to be able to sustain in the ICU in the first place. But then thirdly, I think this thing takes a lot of time. This takes out the response from OG's POI, right? Because they say, oh, we have money to invest. But you don't have the time to invest, you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the consent to invest in all this stuff, right? So this means that it's very unlikely of the house that they imaginary just, give birth to new ICUs. So why this is unique from OO? One, we explained that you slow down the process in order for you to be able to train people in order to actually go into the ICU. And this is the response to CG and OG as well. The COVID was not lethal, yes. The issue is we could not sustain the COVID in the first place. So the people died because they couldn't go into the ICU beds in the first place. They didn't die because the COVID was so lethal. They died because the system couldn't actually respond in a fast occasion in order to be able to sustain people and to treat people, right? But then secondly, to the degree that we are leaving pressure to the personnel, people saw so much death in their side of the house, right? They were so traumatized. There are so many documentaries about the nurses explaining that the scaling of death in ICUs was exponential to an unprecedented degree, right? All of these people were so fucked up they just freeze when they saw people dying and couldn't actually respond. This explains the slowing down part, right? Exactly because we explained better than opening opposition that ventilators are more expensive, more rare, hard to find, and exactly because you need, like empirically, the metrics that scientists use in order to show if we need to open or close was how many people are in the ICU, not how many people are actually affected by the illness, but how many beds are available in the ICU. This is the key metrics that people use and scientists use in order to be able to make sure that we should open or close. Then CG says, oh, this is bad for the economy because specific countries look the competitive advantage. One, this is very uncomparative. I'm not so sure if all countries in the rest of the house have open borders, which one has the least competitive advantage. I think this is very hypothetical. But then the last thing that says, which is very, very funny from CG, anti-vaxxers in the rest of the house are getting worse. Notice, in us in the house, we have so much fucking transnational propaganda in an unprecedented degree that you should be vaccinated. We have famous actors going on TV and explaining how they get vaccinated. We have live television shows showing, the president getting vaccinated. We have so many experts on TV explaining why it's so important to vaccinate. It's mandatory to vaccinate, and to justify the mandatory, the mandatory aspect of the vaccine. Governments spend so much time and money to advertise and campaign exactly because they were infringing their rights, exactly because they were illiterate, and exactly because illegitimate to do this in the first place. The rest of the house is speculative they do this because in Sweden, for them to defend this type of political agenda, they didn't do this stuff. They thought vaccinated might be optional for the organic care to work in the first place. Third response. This is why R&D matters more. And notice, OG is lying. We don't use people that actually get infected to actually gather data. We use people that got infected, and then we saw how the MRI and the CRISPR was successful in order to be able to separate the disease. Okay. Notice how this also plays out on the R&D sector as well. One, I think OG is lying primarily because 4 different nations create a vaccine very fast in the first 6 months, exactly because we use CRISPR that isolates the specific virus and takes the virus into the vaccines in order to be able to do this in the first place. Second, we do research in vitro, not in people, because this requires consent. In vitro means the small thing that you put the virus in and you throw different stuff in it in order to see if it's effective to kill it or not, right? So, come on, I have to clear it. Okay, so this means that the research is probably symmetric, but also better because you see how people react on the vaccine, which is actually necessary. All of this means, one, on scaling, people die more not because it's lethal, but because we cannot sustain them and we cannot cure them in the first place. In nurse of the house, it is more effective to be able to actually have proper personnel and proper prioritization in the ICU in the first place, exactly because you have less people piling up in the line to get an ICU and a ventilator in a position bench. Over and out.
Even if RFK is our messenger, we are the ones who explain the psychological frustration and public health reasoning for why the lockdown was unnecessary. Skepticism happened because our explanations are convincing.
My lord, let's see why organic care does not work. 5 reasons. One, people are dumb and they're afraid to admit that they actually, they have COVID and stuff like that. One, because they're afraid of getting death in the first place, so they don't consider this option. But secondly, for the social stigma that exists in the rest of the house, right? But then thirdly, I think, to the degree that you're downplaying your symptoms, this means that you go out more in the rest of the house, where in the rest of the house it's mandatory. This means in the rest of the house, you transmit more, right? But also, secondly, there are people that don't have symptoms that also transmit this type of disease, right? Exactly because they don't know that they transmit this first place. CG says, oh, there were only 4 mutations. In the rest of the house, I promise you, there is actually data to back this up if you look it after. There would be 12 or 15 mutations. Just saying that there were people dying, it does not mean that there could not be more gazillions people have died in the rest of the house. But then lastly, notice, and this is very important, OG and CG are conditional on international border. But this explains why airports are most crowded place in the cosmos. You cannot track how many people interact with different actors in order to be able to find the spread. And this means that the mutations just exponentially go high. And this is the POI from CO in the beginning, because you cannot keep track, right? And different nations have different immunitary reaction systems. So this means that the mutation capacity goes higher. If I go up what cities tropical places and the sun being different and all the stuff, this makes mutations even higher, because now you have transitional boarding from Bangladesh to Greece and stuff like that. This means that the probability of scaling how many people die and how many people you have to do in the ICU to different mutations is exponentially higher on CO. Lastly, on education, I think, notice, online teaching is good and it's successful to a degree. It's happened for 6 months. You can record stuff and you can chill. Your parents supervise you because they are at home, so you have to do some type of learning. You have to pass some exams. I think this is kind of symmetricized into the whole debate, and I think people dying and scaling the ICU lack of capacity is the most actual responsible reality characterization. Vote CO, vote that.
Okay. We for excellent final